Hello, and welcome to my YouTube video on the story before the story. I'm going to take a brief look at Stanley Park in this video. But first, introductions. My name is Jonathan Waldy, and I'm going to tell you a bit about myself so that you have some idea of who I am and the lens through which this video is presented. I am of European descent, and my family has lived as uninvited guests on Turtle Island, or what settlers have dubbed North America, for only a handful of generations. I currently live and am making this video on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. These are three of the myriad and diverse group of Coast Salish nations. As I am white and European, I have benefited greatly from settler colonial culture while living in what is now called Canada. I identify as a male, although I did not always fit neatly into that box growing up, and still do not conform to the masculine ideal that some people have. I grew up attending public school in British Columbia in the 80s and 90s. At that time, Indigenous issues in Canada were not a big part of my education, and most of what was discussed was done in a historical context, as if they were problems of the past that had been overcome. This video was made as a part of my coursework as a student teacher within the Simon Fraser University Professional Development Program. As I am not a member of any First Nations group, everything I present to you here should be regarded as being filtered through the lens of a settler. It is presented to you by a third party, me. I would ask that if you find this video interesting, you seek out appropriate primary sources that can better represent an Indigenous view. As Musqueam Nation member Wade Grant urges us, we need to learn from the Musqueam people if we really want to connect with and learn about their culture and history. As a note, all links and citations for this video can be found in the description below. Now that I've introduced myself, let's look at the history of the land known by some as Stanley Park. This now urban park sits on land that belongs to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. There are a great many stories presented on and about this land. Most of them are colonial stories, with only a small portion of stories represented being Indigenous ones. Due to settler colonial culture being the dominant culture here, the colonial stories are easy to find when you move about the space or research history in books or online. What is harder to find is the story before that story. Today, we're going to touch a bit on those less heard stories. As the Musqueam Nation is one of the predominant long-standing nations to occupy, use, learn from, and protect this land, I will look mostly at the history they offer to us to learn from. I will also look at some of the Squamish history of the land as well. However, it should be noted that the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations have all lived on this land for thousands of years, and all of them have histories and knowledge from and about the area that is now called Stanley Park. There are many more stories connected to this land than I will be able to cover, and I am by no means an expert, and am on my own journey of discovery into the many histories that exist on this land that go unrepresented. As Chief Ian Campbell from the Squamish First Nation told CBC in an interview, there's really no presence in the park to add value of the contributions and the homelands of our people. He notes in the same interview that there are differences between the three nations in their stories and their names for places and pronunciations. In particular, Chief Ian Campbell was talking about a well-known landmark along the coast of the area. In geological terms, this landmark is known as a sea stack, and currently bears the name given to it by the Vancouver Parks Board as its most common referent among settlers and visitors to the area. That name is Siwash Rock. As Chief Ian Campbell has spoke about with CBC and in his own piece published by the North Shore News, this is not how the three nations that have lived here since time immemorial refer to the rock. Each has their own variation on the name and the story behind it. A side note here, I will do my best throughout this video to pronounce the names in their original language, but again, I'm not a speaker of Coast Salish languages and will likely make several pronunciation errors, For this I apologize, but I do think it is important that I and others work on respecting the local languages that have existed here for thousands of years. It's only by trying and making mistakes that we can learn. I used the Hunkaminam alphabet resource from the Musqueam teaching kit to aid my pronunciation. You can find that in the links below. Now, let's dig into the history of this important site known as Slihelik to the Musqueam people. It begins with hulls, which roughly translates as transformer. Hulls, or transformers, are powerful beings that have marked sites all along this land during their travels. Their name comes from the fact that these markings are the result of them changing people into animals or features of the landscape, and Slihelik is one such landscape feature. The name Slihelik translates into English as standing, and it came into existence when hulls, the transformers, transformed a man to stone for his behavior while he was a human. In a different story from the Musqueam nation about Slihelik, hulls also fought and killed a giant octopus and then tossed the small tentacle aside, which landed at the base of Slihelik. This story serves to explain why there are now many small octopuses that live at the base of the rock today. And according to the Musqueam First Nation, these stories and others like them help remind the Musqueam people of their teachings and the interconnectedness of their territory. Chief Ian Campbell gives us some insight into the Squamish story. The Squamish nation refers to the imposing stone as Slahulsh, aka Standing Man in English. The man who was transformed into the rock was engaged in preparations for the arrival of his unborn child by purifying himself with the use of ritual bathing. This is traditional in the Squamish nation because children are understood to be born pure, and any impurities in the parent will be passed on to the child. While the man was engaged in the ritual bathing, transformers appeared from the spirit realm and asked him to move out of their way. When he refused to comply, they transformed him into the tall stone stack to remind everyone of the responsibilities of parenthood. As Chief Ian Campbell informed readers, there is no representation of these histories from these three nations on this land. In fact, there have been repeated attempts to eradicate these histories from the land, and yet they survive. But Chief Ian Campbell reminds us that it is important to make space for and respect these histories and their lessons. There has been a movement to change or add signage that respects Indigenous place names. Slihelik is one such place name that Indigenous peoples and their allies have argued for. Why is this important? Well, let's look at the history of the current name that is recognized by the Vancouver Parks Board. It is rooted in Chinook Jargon, a trading pidgin that was derived from Chinook. Chinook itself was another pidgin that was used before settlers arrived by coastal First Nations from the area now known as California up to what is now called Alaska. Chinook Jargon came about in the 1700s and 1800s when settler and Métis fur traders moved west over the mountains to the coast and began trading with the Indigenous peoples there. It was a mix of Chinook, English, French, and several Coast Salish languages. In Chinook jargon, Siwash was the term used to refer to Indigenous peoples. The problem is that the etymology of that word comes from the French word sauvage, which translates to savage in English. This is obviously a problematic name, and rather than reminding Indigenous peoples of their history and their lessons, the rock with this name has now become a symbol of the myth of colonial superiority. This symbol sits near the site of several villages that were on the land that Stanley Park now occupies. These were homes to families that came from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. The existence of these villages is another history that I was ignorant to until very recently. The largest of these communities was Huaihui, a village that existed and was in use for thousands of years. Despite the village's long history, most settlers and visitors are left completely ignorant of Huaihui's existence and the existence of many other villages on this site after they visit. Looking at the map, we can see that the area now used as a park was once home to many people. Yet most visitors, both domestic and foreign, never hear these stories. They may see the rose garden of settler heritage, or the statues of settler figures, such as a previous mayor of the city, or a Governor General of Canada for whom the current park is named, and they may even leave with a sense that this land belongs to Indigenous peoples. But they will have no idea of the millennia of history that lives on this land that predates any settler arrival. Thank you for taking the time to briefly explore a little more history of the area now called Stanley Park. If you found this video interesting, please seek out more information directly from the nations as they offer it. Goodbye, and good luck on your educational journey.